In this presentation, I will talk about the need to understand psychological coercion or control and trauma in the context of criminal investigations, and in particular in the context of human trafficking situations. In much of the literature related to psychological control, and in particular related to the human trafficking investigations, it has been quite well established that we can talk about invisible chains. So chains that are not physical. These victims may not be restrained. For example, they may not be locked into a room. They may physically have all the possibilities to walk away, so to say, and yet they may not do so, and they may not be actually psychologically capable of doing so. This is a difficult issue for the criminal justice system, because normally to really have evidence for a crime, you need to have quite tangible evidence. And of course, what happens in the human mind is not that tangible. It's very much harder to both identify and in particular to showcase strongly enough for a court case to be assessed based on that. It's also, when we talk about psychological coercion, we refer to a situation in which the victim feels they have no choice but to, for example, obey the perpetrator, or stay on in a situation that is abusive, or sell sex to people although they wouldn't want to. And this coercion can be taking place through various measures. One, of course, there may be aspects of isolating the victims from their own environments or from people who might be supportive to them and making them dependent only on the perpetrator. There may be very concrete things such as not giving them the possibility to use their own money or phones or other means of leading an independent life. But there may also be, as for example can be seen in many cases in intimate partner relationship violence, there may be situations where the perpetrator is both using, for example, threats or other negative ways of communicating or interacting with the victim, but also every now and then alternating with very positive interactions. And this may actually be even more binding for the victim, maybe make them even more inclined to stay on in this situation. It's been established in the literature that actual violence is not necessary to make the victim afraid to the point that they don't feel they can leave the situation. And that psychological, it's more that the perpetrator creates a sort of if not atmosphere where they are sort of all the time aware that something terrible can happen if they don't act the way the perpetrator seems to want them to. And it's also known that psychological forms of violence can actually really break down the agency of a person, making them quite unable to actually be independent. As I said, also positive interaction can actually reinforce the kind of a bond between the perpetrator and the victim. And this may be, for example, we can have in trafficking cases, there can be situations where the perpetrator is first establishing kind of a relationship as a boyfriend or a lover or a parental figure to the victim. And then the relationship sort of slowly turns into a very coercive and negative relationship and abusive. And sometimes the victim may not really understand their situation until it's far too late. People are actually, if we, for example, fall in love with someone, we may be very inclined to see only the good aspects of that person and like lay all our hopes, everything we dreamt of in our image of that person, and we may be utterly unable to see all their weaknesses and weak spots. And this may occur also in the context of trafficking or other criminal situations, intimate partner relationship or love scams, for example. So the perpetrator may make the victim fall in love with them, may be fantastically lovely to them until they are completely dependent or they are in a situation where they are bound by something to the perpetrator. And then they may sort of turn the relationship into an abusive one. And from the victim's perspective, it might be very hard to accept that one has been lured into this kind of abusive relationship. So we may have quite strong defenses against realizing this, and really try to see that no, this person is still a good person. I'm sure he loves me, or they love me, but I should just behave in a different way. So the victim might be quite inclined to change their own way of thinking, to have a distorted view of both the perpetrator and the interaction. And we know that victims who have previous vulnerabilities are especially vulnerable to this. So they are less good at sort of protecting themselves from these kind of abusive relationships. Another thing is that if a perpetrator has succeeded in sort of eliminating all other relationships, or at least all other healthy relationships from the life of the victim, the unknown might be even more frightening for the victim than this known perpetrator. Humans in general are afraid of the unknown, and it might be really frightening to think that here I moved to another maybe country to be together with this man of my dreams, who then turned up not to be the man of my dreams, and there's no way in which I can contact people I used to have relationships with, and I'm alone in a country, the language of which I do not speak. It's clear that the situation is really very, very frightening for the victim. Maybe talking about this kind of positive interaction, one theme that often comes up is the so-called Stockholm syndrome, which typically refers to a situation where a person is held hostage and then starts developing positive feelings for the perpetrator. And this maybe has been slightly misunderstood, so that it would always be about sort of falling in love and then freely staying with the perpetrator. And in fact, whereas this kind of interaction can be absurd in many cases, it's quite likely that it's more quite rational behavior on the part of the victim. It's a way to stay alive, to make sure that they are being treated as well as possible by the perpetrator. And it can also be the consequence of really being isolated from anyone else. So if you are completely dependent, the only social interaction you have is with the perpetrator, who every now and then is treating you nicely or decently, then this might create a sort of positive bond, because there's a total absence of any other human interaction. And we humans most of us are so dependent on having human interaction that even a poor interaction is better than none. I was personally an expert in a court case where a woman had been a victim of a particularly terrible crime where her husband had been killed and their house has been burned to the ground, and she had been taken hostage by the perpetrators. They had taken her in their car, and she was driven by one of the perpetrators who she knew had probably killed her husband. They had been taken. This was in northern Finland, and they were driving all the way to Sweden. On the way, they stopped in a shop, and there is a video recording from that shop of the two of them, this woman and the man who held her hostage. And I was asked just to give an expert statement by the police, because they were worried the demeanor of the woman would lead to the false understanding that she might have been in it somehow of free will, or that she wasn't as traumatized by it as she was. Because she behaved very calmly in the shop. The man said, well, we should have coffee. And she said, yes, let's have some buns to go with it. And, oh, I need a toothbrush. So it really didn't seem like she would be terrified. However, it is quite likely that she was still in an utter state of shock. And this, when people are in a state of shock, this might really come across as behaving very calmly, very rationally. And of course, at some point, the shock may sort of, there may be a kind of a much stronger emotional reaction. But there we people are very different. The other explanation is also, of course, that this was very rational on her behalf. She knew that this man was capable of doing very terrible things, and I think it would have been rational, at least, to think that if she behaves in a way that is as little annoying him as possible, then she sort of reinforces her chances of surviving. And indeed, when they were later, when she was rescued by the police in Sweden, from a hotel room, she broke down completely when she realized that now she's safe. So I think this would strengthen this theory of her being in a state of shock. In trafficking, as I mentioned, isolating the victim is something that has been found in research to be how would you say, quite a successful measure of breaking down the agency of victims. And this, of course, in particular is true for victims from other countries where maybe the perpetrator is the only person they actually can share a common language with. So they are often utterly alone. One aspect that makes people much more vulnerable to this kind of interaction is what we know as trauma bonding. So we know that in itself, like the aspects of the victim's background can render them particularly vulnerable. And this may be, for example, vulnerabilities in the background, a history where there have been no reliable contacts, there have been no reliable people to rely on or build trust and good relationships with. And in the perpetrator-victim relationship, the perpetrator can actually benefit from this. And for example, when looking at the literature on trauma bonding, the trauma bonding has been found to include an imbalance of power between the two, the perpetrator using alternately negative and positive interactions, as I described earlier, and the victim being sort of grateful for anything that is positive interaction, and also blaming themselves for when they are when the perpetrator behaves in a negative way. And also the victim sort of assuming the perspective of the perpetrator. So their own perception is really changed into that of the perpetrators. I'm going to say just a few words then about traumatic experiences, as the one I gave an example of previously. First of all, it should be acknowledged that you do not need to be traumatized to be vulnerable. And in fact, many people would agree that all humans who are in interaction with the criminal justice system are potentially vulnerable in that position. Even perpetrators of crimes can be vulnerable in their in that context. And we also know that how traumatic or potentially traumatic experiences affect people varies quite a bit. Most of us experience during the course of our lives experiences that are potentially traumatizing, and most of us self-heal within a few months from these. So just losing a dear person suddenly, a parent is died in a car crash. That's a terribly, potentially very traumatizing event that, however, for most people would likely lead to a state of shock and trauma and terror for a few months, and then turn into grief, but still be something that the person can live with and can discuss, can talk about. Then again, sometimes these potentially traumatizing experiences actually lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. And we know that experiences such as crime or the violent sudden death of a close person, experiences of severe violence and sexual violence, torture, these are particularly potentially traumatizing. And we know that for persons to actually create what is known as PTSD, these kinds of experiences are often or tend to be in the background, and they are often expressed in the person, such as recurring memories that are terrible. They may come also as nightmares or flashbacks, and the person may really have a hard time not remembering these issues. So even though the person may try and struggle to not remember them, they are just like coming through. This may lead in itself to avoidance. This is a very typical behavior for traumatized persons. So they try to avoid anything that resembles or reminds them of the initial trauma. And of course, this can lead to a situation that is very hard to live in. If you have been, for example, you have lost your child in a car accident and you have been there with the child, if this leads to you avoiding anything that reminds you of children or cars, then you will lead a life that is completely impossible to lead among other people. And of course, it's not possible to go on that way. So what you then need is a kind of therapy that exposes you slowly and in small doses and in a in a sort of reliable context or trusty context to these experiences, so as to make them part of your life history that you can live with. Traumatized victims or memories of traumatizing situations can differ somewhat from memories of ordinary situations, but not as much as is sometimes argued. It has been argued that very traumatizing events are completely sort of forgotten, that they are repressed and they cannot be then accessed by memory, but maybe they will then, for example, in therapy years after, come across. And this does not really seem to be backed up by science, in the sense that there does not seem to be a completely different memory system for traumatic events. But what is true is, of course, that it's often very difficult for the person to actively recall traumatic events. The tendency to try to avoid them is strong. And what is also known is that in traumatic situations, we tend to narrow our focus and remember just most strongly the things that have been really the most scaring, at the expense of other details. So the memories can be sort of stronger and more intense, but for some certain central aspects mostly, at the expense of other things. So they may seem fragmented because of this. And it has also been found that in relation to traumatic experiences, some sensory information can be even stronger than in other memories. Most importantly, however, we know that whereas many of us would like, or traumatized persons would like to forget these experiences, they are normally harder to forget than neutral experiences, but they are also difficult to talk about. So in the investigative interview, we really need to have people who are particularly good at creating rapport, at supporting the person. And for example, if the person really is starting to experience clear signs of stress in the interview, to really calm them down, help them breathe. That you can really use calm, like breathing techniques can be quite efficient to make people calm down. Just look at me, everything is fine. Just breathe with me. And the mere fact that the interviewer or the person discussing with the traumatized person is calm, are calm themselves, this tends to have a calming effect on the person. It can also be very important to sort of, if the person really gets very, very stressed in the interview, it can be important to sort of tell them that now we are here in this room, here there is nothing that is dangerous and you are quite safe here. This was back then, and now today nothing of this is going on. Because the memories can be really so strong that the person feels like they are back in that original traumatic situation. So all in all, regarding traumatic situations, it's important to understand that whereas traumatic situations can be remembered to some extent differently, there is no completely separate memory mechanism for traumatic events. They might lose peripheral details, they may have stronger and more vivid memories of central detail, they may have more sensory information, smells or noises, etc. And they are often very hard to try to remember, to actively recall in an investigative interviewing context. So they require time and patience and a very good rapport between the interviewer and the victim.